Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. It's episode 2618 of The Tom Woods Show. And we have with us William Van Wagenen, whom I have never met before, but who comes highly recommended to me from our great friend Scott Horton. And I've been reading a bit of his work over at The Cradle, where he writes. He also writes for the Libertarian Institute. And I want to talk to him about what's happening in Syria, hoping that a lay audience that doesn't have a huge background in the history of that area can nevertheless get a handle on how we ought to feel about what's happening there. Particularly over the past few months. So first of all, Will, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Appreciate the invite.
Now tell me, I understand you recently took a trip over there. So when was that, how long, and what was the nature of the trip?
So as part of my work for The Cradle, I was in Beirut, Lebanon during the war between Hezbollah and Israel this last fall. And then, of course, it came as a surprise, but the Syrian government fell in early December. And due to the chaos, the borders were just open. So I was right there in Beirut. And so I just went across the border. And I was in Syria for about 2 months. And I just got home about 2 weeks ago. So I had a chance, really amazing chance to travel through most of the country and just to talk to a lot of people about things that happened, during the war that started in 2011 and ended in about 2018. And then obviously was able to see and talk to people about what had just happened a few months ago. So it was great. It was a great opportunity.
No doubt. So first of all, does it vary by where you are in the country? In terms of people's political opinions, or let's say how much authority the new regime is able to extend, is that uniform across the whole country? Like, what are there any differences you uncovered?
Yeah, there are a lot of differences. I mean, Syria is a very diverse country. There are different sects of Muslims. There are Alawite Muslims. There are Sunni Muslims. Sunnis are the majority. There are Christians, many Christians. There are Druze, Ismaili Muslims are another sect. So it's a really diverse place, and people have very diverse opinions as well, both about what happened during the war while Bashar al-Assad was in power, and then also, about what's happening now and whether they're happy about the changes or not happy about the changes. I can't say that most people were happy that Bashar al-Assad was gone. He was liked very, very much, actually, back in, say, 2010, 2011, before that war started. And if you like, we could talk about that because the U.S., the CIA, and the State Department and Israel played a big role in sparking the war that led to all of this. But most people by now, after 14 years of war and actually crushing U.S. economic sanctions, most people were kind of desperate for a change and for something new. And so a lot of people were optimistic when Abu Mohammed Jolani and his faction took power in December. And for those that don't know, Jolani, he now is the president of Syria, and he goes by Ahmed al-Shara. But he is an old al-Qaeda in Iraq commander. So he fought for al-Qaeda in Iraq after the U.S. invasion starting in 2003, spent time in a U.S. prison in Iraq. But then he was among many people who were released, in my opinion, deliberately by the U.S. in order to send them to Syria to start the war in 2011. But people have mixed opinions of him. A lot of people were optimistic and said, hey, we know about his terrorist background, but things were so bad, before, maybe he can make things better. But in these past few days, there have been a series of really terrible, terrible massacres against the Alawite minority. that the old president Bashar al-Assad came from. And so I think even people who were optimistic before, after what's happened in these past few days, everyone's really upset about what's happening. Not just people from the Alawite community, but people, from many parts of Syrian society.
Well, who outside of Syria, like in the U.S., for example, was cheering when the new government took over? Because I feel like on social media, I was seeing a whole bunch of people assuring me that these were going to be wonderful, moderate people. And I just thought, you know what? I know nothing about them, but I've heard this show and this song and dance before, so I'm going with probably not. And just rolling the dice on what is the likelihood that people who've been wrong about every foreign policy matter in my lifetime are suddenly right about Syria. And it looks like, I've been vindicated without even trying. Now, Emma, is that too simplistic?
Oh, no, that sounds about right. I mean, the reason that many people in Washington and also in Tel Aviv were cheering is that when Jolani and his group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which again was the official al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria in past years, when they took over and ousted President Assad in December, that was the culmination of a very, very long project on the part of the U.S. and Israel and their respective intelligence agencies that began during the old War on Terror days. So I'm sure many of your listeners might know that right after 9/11, there was talk among Bush administration officials, neoconservatives, that had a pro-Israel agenda. There was talk about trying to topple 7 different governments within 5 years. And so, Afghanistan was invaded, of course. Iraq was invaded, even though, of course, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. But Syria was also on that list of target countries, and it just took a bit longer to get around to getting to Syria. So when the so-called Arab Spring started, which were these protests throughout different Arab countries in 2011 against the different autocratic or dictatorship style governments that were in place in the Arab world, those protests were not grassroots. They were actually color revolutions that were deliberately planned and sparked by the CIA, the State Department. And so that happened in Syria as well. That's when the operation was really launched to try to topple the Syrian government because it was an enemy of Israel. And Syria had a strong army that Israel wanted to eliminate. And so those protests that started back in 2011 in Syria as part of the Arab Spring, those were actually orchestrated again by the US and the State Department and the Israelis. But in addition to just sparking protests, they also, again, released all these al-Qaeda in Iraq militants from the Buqa prison in southern Iraq, and they all flooded into Syria and started attacking Syrian security forces and the army, killing security forces. There were a lot of false flag killings as well. So these al-Qaeda militants opening fire on the protesters and then blaming it on the Syrian army and police, much like we saw in Ukraine in 2014, if people are familiar with the role that snipers played in the protests in 2014 in Ukraine that toppled the government at that time. But so anyways, it's been a long project to topple the Syrian government, and it resulted in that 14-year war. But Assad was not actually toppled finally until December. And so when it actually happened, all of the people in the US and Israel who planned it and who, tried for all those years to make it happen, they were very, very happy. And, the CIA even had a name for the operation to topple the Syrian government during those years. It was called Timber Sycamore. And they had a budget of over $1 billion a year that they spent in order to provide weapons and money to these al-Qaeda militants that went by different names at different times. But it was $1 billion a year the CIA had as their budget. And they spent way, way more money because they got help from the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks, who also spent huge amounts of money for the operation. So I guess to summarize, there was this project to use al-Qaeda, these Muslim extremists, to topple the Syrian government on behalf of Israel in order to destroy the Syrian state, divide it, and make sure it could not ever resist Israeli hegemony in the region. And so that, again, because that was finally a success after all these years, those elements in Washington were very, very happy. And I think they're still happy about it, even though in the last few days, they've been critical of these recent massacres against the Alawite minority that the new government that they installed in power just committed.
Hey folks, tired of the Fed being in control of your finances? Monetary Metals is revolutionizing how you can grow your wealth outside the system and gain greater control of your finances by growing your gold in ounces every single month, as I myself do in my Monetary Metals account. With Monetary Metals' gold leasing program, clients can earn 3% annual interest on their gold, paid every single month in more ounces of physical gold. Gold prices broke all-time highs in 2024. Now you can get your gold to work for you, generating additional interest income every month. The interest you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold or silver, which you get in addition to any price appreciation from gold and silver during the year. Join thousands of investors like me who are already earning interest income every month paid in gold and silver. This is a no-brainer for gold owners. Now is the time to secure your wealth and build your legacy in an asset the government can't inflate away. The Fed can print dollars, they can't print gold. Now's the time for you to do what I do. Start growing your wealth in ounces with Monetary Metals. Go to monetary-metals.com/woods to learn more. That's monetary-metals.com/woods. But I'm reading in the paper that supposedly now they're saying, well, we're going to get to the bottom of whoever carried out these massacres and has the blood of Syrians on his hands. Can you tell the story of, did these just come out of the clear blue? Like what was the rationale for this brutality?
Well, there's a lot of bad blood that built up during the previous war in the previous 14 years. Alawites, this Muslim religious minority, they played a big role in the Syrian military under Bashar al-Assad, and Assad himself was Alawite. But there are also many Sunni Muslims who were part of the old government and part of the old army. But the problem is that the agents that the U.S. and Israel chose to empower to try to overthrow the government are, as I mentioned, are these Islamic extremists. They're not like average Sunni Muslims. I've had many Sunni Muslim friends over the years, and they're all wonderful people. But the folks that the U.S. and Israel empowered are fundamentalist extremists who have a very sectarian outlook, and they view Alawite Muslims and Shia Muslims as unbelievers that should be killed. And so that was that was a lot of the motivation for these fighters to participate in the war over the last 14 years, was to kill Alawites and Shiites, considering them infidels. And so then now that this new government took power, which was full of these people, including many foreigners, many Islamic extremists from other countries, from Uzbekistan, from Chechnya, from China, from Tunisia, from Saudi Arabia. They were all had flooded into Syria to help fight during the war after 2011. And the new Syrian government incorporated these people into the new government. So it was a government full of extremists, and ever since they took power in December, there have been massacres of Alawites that live mostly in these coastal regions in western Syria near the sea. And so there have been massacres, and then finally this last week, some remnants of the old Syrian army ambushed some members of the new Syrian security forces. And then in response to that, the new government and the security forces and these extremist militants that belong to them, they all descended upon these Alawite villages and cities from across the country, and were just going house by house, murdering entire families. So I have a lot of Syrian friends who have had friends who were killed. I have one Syrian friend whose father was killed on Friday. where these militants affiliated with the new government just broke down the door to their house. It killed his father and stole everything that was inside. So just based on me being an American who has some Syrian friends and hearing so many stories of people I know that know people who were killed, I mean, it's got to be a large number. Some people say 1,000, 2,000 civilians were massacred over the course of the last few days. I, of course, don't know what the actual numbers are, but just anecdotally, I can say that the number is very large and it's affecting a large number of Syrians, and many people are upset about it, not just members of the Alawite community.
Now, as you spoke to people in Syria and traveled around the country over the course of 2 months, what did you most want to find out? What did you most want to be able to come home and say you had learned?
Oh, well, a lot of things. I mean, I wanted to see what was actually happening, and I got there just a few days after the government fell. As I was driving from Beirut to Damascus, the Israelis were still bombing all these Syrian army sites. The Meza military airport, which is in the outskirts of Damascus, was still on fire as I drove in. And then the first few nights, I was woken up every night by the sound of bombing when I was in Damascus. So I just wanted to see what was happening at that moment and to see what the change would be like. But also, I've written about Syria for many, many years and the U.S. and Israeli support for these al-Qaeda groups. You know, in the past, during the war, these groups were promoted in the U.S. as democratic freedom fighters and things like that. And I did a lot of writing showing that that wasn't the case, and that the U.S. was supporting al-Qaeda in Syria while always, you know, publicly claiming that they were our enemies or that they are terrorist groups that we are opposed to. So I just wanted to see what was, you know, going to happen in the country, and then also, just to be able to speak to Syrians freely, because under Assad, it was a very authoritarian government and people couldn't speak freely. And I had been to Syria in the past, but just as a tourist, and so I couldn't speak freely with people. So I just wanted to know what people's opinions were, not only about what was happening in that moment, but also about all these past events in the war that were very controversial. For example, in 2013, there was a chemical attack in the outskirts of Damascus that killed over 1,000 people and that almost triggered a major war, Western intervention in Syria. But President Obama called it off kind of at the last second at the time. But there was just so much that had happened, and just to be able to travel around and see the whole country and talk to people from all different aspects of life and different sects and of different political opinions. That was the reason that, I wanted to go, and I learned a ton. There's so much that I learned. So it was really, I feel really lucky I was able to go.
I don't mean to sound like I'm repeating myself, but I just can't get over that at this late stage, people are still going for the democratic freedom fighters line. You know, I mean, that was the kind of line that would make John McCain sign on the dotted line, but we're all smarter than John McCain. So why is that still working with people? You know, how many times does this have to happen?
Yeah, I mean, the mainstream media.
I mean, maybe that's a rhetorical question, you know?
Yeah. But again, the mainstream media, they always, of course, spin things in a way that's beneficial to U.S. foreign policy. And that's what they've been doing this entire time. And there was some acknowledgement of the current president's terrorist past. But just days after he came to power, a U.S. State Department official, Barbara Leaf, she visited Damascus, and they dropped the $10 million bounty from Jolani's head, which was just kind of another sign that all these years of calling him a terrorist and saying that, putting a bounty on his head and things like that, these were just cosmetic things to kind of give the U.S. government plausible deniability for the covert support that we were providing. But it's been actually interesting in these past few days. Suddenly, the Israeli government, which supported al-Qaeda in Syria in the past, in Jolani, the current president, they used to give weapons and money to al-Qaeda fighters that had taken over territory along the southern parts of Syria that are on the Israeli border. So even though the Israelis and the U.S. strongly supported Jolani in the past, suddenly in the past few days, the Syrian defense minister has been coming out and calling the Syrian president a terrorist, which of course he was, but why are the Israelis suddenly pointing that out now, which of course we've known it for 14 years. And then also Marco Rubio came out and made a similar statement in response to these massacres. And so it's like he's our guy in Damascus, and yet they're now pointing out that he's a terrorist. And to me, that's also very alarming because it shows that even though that regime change operation was finally successful in December, the United States and Israel are not going to allow Syria to suddenly prosper and become, a safe and a good country again. After all these years of war, it shows that even though they got the regime change they wanted, they're still committed to dividing the country up even further, sparking more sectarian violence. And again, that's always been Israel's goal for decades now, is to divide Syria and Iraq along ethnic lines, keep those countries weak and in a permanent state of war, sectarian war, where Arabs of different religions or different ethnicities, Kurds versus Arabs, Christians versus Muslims, Sunnis versus Shiites, that these groups are constantly fighting each other. And that just allows Israel to continue to dominate the region, to occupy new land. Israel, as soon as the new government took power in December, in addition to massively bombing all of the Syrian military sites across the country, they did like 480 airstrikes within just 2 days. But in addition to that, the Israelis occupied a bunch of additional territory in the south of the country. And that's part of their long-term goal, to continue to expand the borders of Israel, to steal more land, from Syrians and Lebanese, just like they do from Palestinians. So I don't know. It's just very, it's just like again, they spin things whichever way, is useful to them, given their goals.
Yeah. Well, it so happens, just by interesting happenstance, that it was 14 years ago, pretty much the very week you and I are recording this, that the Syrian civil war started. Can you explain again, for the layman who doesn't know all the parties at work, what exactly what the triggering factor was, like what the nature of the dispute was? And then I want to bring in what you said earlier about the role of the U.S., et cetera, in having stoked that.
Yeah. So again, back in 2010, all these protests broke out across these different Arab countries, and there are many reasons for people to protest. It's not like all of these governments were good or perfect, but in Syria, most people did support the president, and the country was improving. The economic situation was very good. People could study for free. They got free healthcare. And there was, peace and security in the country. And, people now, when they talk about that period before 2011, they talk about Syria as being heaven. That's the word they use. They say it was like heaven back then. Again, there were still problems, and the government did some bad things, of course, but by and large, the situation was quite good. So, but again, there was this effort on the part of the U.S. government to destroy Syria, plunge it into sectarian chaos. And so President Obama in late 2010, he organized a series of meetings between the National Security Council, the State Department, the CIA, and they issued after those meetings, what was called Presidential Study Directive 11. And that directive basically called for the U.S. government to try to spark protests in these different Arab countries, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, etc., to topple all of those governments and to put the Muslim Brotherhood in power. And the Muslim Brotherhood are Islamic extremists. So again, that's what happened in all these different countries, not only in Syria, but Tunisia, Egypt, etc., even though those countries were U.S. allies. And part of the strategy to do that was they trained a lot of activists from those countries to use new technologies like Facebook to try to organize protests and to spread rumors and to destabilize the country. And a big part of that also was, again, to dispatch like false flag snipers and that would go to the protests, open fire on protesters, blame it on the government. And so that, just sparked the cycle where the protests got bigger, more and more people got angry at the government. And then, as I mentioned, in the case of Syria, the U.S. and intelligence agencies pushed these al-Qaeda fighters into the country, gave them tons of arms and weapons, and told them to basically run wild and kill Syrian security forces as well. So, that just sparked this terrible, terrible war. And over the course of the war, both the al-Qaeda militants and the Syrian government, did a lot of bad things to Syrians. And it's just been a horrific mess ever since, with millions of people displaced, a couple 100,000 people killed. And Syrians have just been suffering ever since, as a result of these U.S. and Israeli policies.
Your old friend Woods is about to improve your life yet again by saving you a bundle. I'd like to tell you about my friends at Federated Computer, who are changing the way businesses buy software. We all need software to run our business, but the best business software doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars each month. The typical Federated Computer customer saves 75% or more of their software bill and gets great software, top-notch customer service and support, and a software solution that is uniquely installed for your business and without any surveillance or breaches of privacy. For example, if you use Google for email, Salesforce for CRM, Slack for team chat, ListMonkey for customer communications, and Airtable for data management, with a team of 10, you'd save $9,000 per year on software costs switching to Federated Computer. And what's wild, the cost of Federated Computer doesn't grow as your team grows. You can use your Federated Computer savings to grow your business rather than feed the woke Silicon Valley software companies. The Federated Computer team invented computing in the cloud. Now they're taking a hammer to the ridiculously high prices of business software and have many, many satisfied customers to prove they deliver. In fact, Federated Computer has been a longtime supporter of the Tom Woods Show, and they're offering 30% off their already low prices when you use coupon code, guess what it is, Woods. Go to www.federated.computer to begin to save 75% or more on your monthly software costs. That's www.federated.computer. These folks are going to do you a big, big favor, so check them out. So it sure seems to me as if Syrians have every right to feel a particular way about the U.S., that Iraqis have every reason to feel a particular way about the U.S. It astonishes me that the U.S. government can posture as the moral conscience of the world when you look at all these hotspots and it's on the wrong side of, if not all of them, pretty darn close to all of them, or it's creating hotspots where there weren't any before. And I think for a long time it was hard for people, let's say on the right side of the spectrum in the U.S. to admit this because they took it personally. If you criticize my government, well, I mean, I am the government. Like they bought the whole propaganda line, so you must be criticizing me or something. Like we couldn't get it through to, like they would immediately rush to the defense of their government and look for rationalizations for what they were doing, the same way that, some poor sucker in the Soviet Union might try to explain away what Pravda was doing, except the Soviet knew it was a lie, so he didn't bother. But I think now what's happened is I think at least there are some Americans now, even on the right side of the spectrum, the ones who had been the hardest to reach, who are starting to think maybe the whole thing's a big mess that we shouldn't have been involved in the first place, which is not good enough, but that's a start. I think more people are at least thinking that way.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I remember the years you're referring to, like when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, at the height of the U.S. occupation and the sectarian war that erupted in Iraq, and after that invasion, I was in Iraq working for a humanitarian aid organization. and actually survived a kidnapping in Iraq 2 years later. But I remember those times and the arguments I got in with many like Republican friends about how bad the U.S. invasion of Iraq was. And they didn't really like hearing that so much. And the Democrats were opposed to it. But then once Obama took power, suddenly the Democrats that used to kind of have these anti-war opinions, suddenly those opinions went out the door and there were no more anti-war protests. And the Democrats just supported Obama very strongly when, these same policies continued. And, it's largely, neoconservatives, Israel first people or Zionists who control U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And whether it's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, we see those neoconservatives still in power in Washington in top positions. During the Bush years, it was like Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and these people. And then in the Obama years, Victoria Nuland and Antony Blinken, these type of people dominate. And whether Republican or Democrat, they have the same agenda, which is to sow chaos in the Middle East on behalf of Israel. And they've done an excellent job of roping the United States into basically doing their dirty work for them. And that's especially the case in the 2003 Iraq War, which I don't think that many people understand, is that the pro-Israeli elements within the U.S. government were critical in fabricating the intelligence to blame Iraq for weapons of mass destruction. And that whole Iraq War in 2003 was done on behalf of Israel to try to open up Iraq to get oil out of Israel or out of Iraq for Israel. And again, just to destroy a powerful Arab army that could potentially be an enemy to the Israelis in the region. So the 3,000 to 4,000 American soldiers who died, and the many, many more who were injured, unbeknownst to them, they were fighting not for America or to make America safe, or to bring democracy. I think that was what they felt they were fighting for. But sadly, they were fighting basically to do Israel's dirty work. And in addition to the American soldiers that were killed, of course, at least hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed as well. So it's just, very disheartening. But it happens, Democrat or Republican, at the end of the day, the same people seem to control the policy towards the Middle East. And we're seeing that, of course, after the 7th of October, when the Israelis get whatever they want out of our government, whether it's Biden or now Trump. The Israelis get as many bombs as they want, if they want to drop them on women and children in Gaza, or whether, whatever or on Lebanese women and children. It's just kind of the same old story.
You keep saying or talking about spreading chaos and disorder throughout the Middle East. And so I wonder if you would state it this way, that a lot of times we hear people saying, well, it's true, the war on terror has had some unintended consequences. But, when you have the same consequence over and over and over and over, I start to wonder if it really is unintended. I mean, a normal person seeing a bad result happening again and again stops doing the thing. And this is true in domestic policy also. They try policy A, it leads to outcome B every single time. But every single time they do it, we're supposed to believe that outcome B is just some unintended consequence that no one could possibly have expected. And it sounds like you are rightly cynical enough to believe that maybe the unintended consequences, quote unquote, are the intended consequences.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So to use as an example, the Iraq War in 2003, again, the U.S. government, when the invasion was launched, Bush and his people were saying, like, this is going to help Iraqis because they're living under dictatorship, Saddam Hussein. Of course, it was true that Saddam was a terrible guy. But then Bush said, it's going to help Iraqis. We're going to bring democracy and we're going to rebuild. We're going to do nation building, all these things. But if you look at the policies that Bush's people, again, who are neoconservative Jewish Zionists in his administration, if you look at the policies they immediately implemented, you can tell it was deliberate, that they were trying to sow chaos and actually spark a sectarian war. So Paul Bremer, who was put in charge of the U.S. occupation from the first days, he immediately issued an order to completely disband the Iraqi army. And he issued an order to prevent any members of the Ba'ath Party from being part of the new government. And they also basically introduced al-Qaeda in Iraq into the country. Again, they always claimed that al-Qaeda was our enemy and that we were fighting al-Qaeda, but Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who is the founder of al-Qaeda in Iraq and began doing suicide bombings against the Shiite Muslims and calling for Sunni Muslims to fight a genocidal war against the Shia of Iraq. He was supported by the United States and created by the United States and Israel. And so the sectarian war that followed, that killed, again, as I mentioned, a couple 100,000 people, was the direct result of U.S. policies. And we see that again in Syria now. So again, when I was in Iraq in 2005, I lived in Baghdad. And I remember talking to so many Iraqis who said, when the U.S. invaded, we were actually happy. We thought that, hey, things were so bad because of Saddam and because of the crushing U.S. sanctions that had been in place throughout the Clinton administration and that killed so many people. We thought things were going to get better. And again, they were assuming that the United States was actually coming to help. But again, that's not what the pro-Israel people in the Bush administration wanted, was to make Iraq a prosperous and peaceful country. They wanted to completely destroy it and break it into parts that would be weak, a Kurdish part in the north, a Sunni part in the west, a Shia part in the south, where these different ethnic groups would constantly be fighting each other, just to ensure that Israel would be the most powerful country in the region. And as I mentioned, to extract Iraqi oil for Israeli use. That was their goal. And so, unfortunately, the same thing is happening in Syria now, it looks like, where the U.S. helped al-Qaeda and Israel helped these former al-Qaeda people and these extremists to take power in Syria. But they're not just going to let even this new president, Jolani, stabilize the country and try to make life better for for Syrians. Instead, the U.S. is saying, "Oh, we're not going to remove the sanctions," and then now the Israelis and even in the past days, Rubio, suddenly they've turned on their old asset, Jolani, and they're saying, "Oh, he's a terrorist now." So they're going to make sure that Syria again stays divided and isolated, so that the Israelis can continue to occupy land in Syria and justify their occupation, saying, "Oh, well, there's this terrorist in power in Damascus, so we need a buffer zone to keep ourselves safe." Or, "Oh, look at these massacres of these minorities. We need to continue our occupation of Syria because we're going to protect them." It's all just very, very cynical. But these patterns just keep repeating. And so, yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying that you're exactly right. It's all about creating chaos. It's not about spreading democracy or rebuilding or protecting people from human rights violations or protecting minorities, Christians or Druze or Alawites or otherwise.
Will, what's your background?
So I went to Brigham Young University and studied German literature when I was a lot younger. And then at that time, I started getting interested in the Middle East. And so I ended up studying Arabic and doing a study abroad in the West Bank in Palestine during the Second Intifada. And then I ended up working for a human rights group called the Christian Peacemaker Teams in Baghdad after the U.S. invasion, as I mentioned. A colleague of mine, an American named Tom Fox, was kidnapped and murdered in Baghdad during that period. And then I was later kidnapped in the Sinjar region of Iraq. This was in 2007 as I was working for that organization. So ever since then, I've taken of course, I've remained interested in the Middle East, and then I began writing for the Libertarian Institute about the Syria war about 7 or 8 years ago, and then I started working for the Cradle as a journalist full-time about 2 years ago. So I've been living primarily in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon for the past 2 years or so. And Scott is very gracious at Scott Horton of the Libertarian Institute, who is your good friend, as you mentioned. He's publishing a book of mine about the Syria war that should be coming out pretty soon. It's about the war, that started in 2011.
All right. There are 3 more things I want to hit. One is we want to say something about the Libertarian Institute, so I'm glad you mentioned that. So I'll get to that in a minute. But you just said 2 extraordinary things, and I'm going to take the less extraordinary of them. My understanding is that Arabic is a very difficult language to learn. What was your experience?
Yeah, it is hard. I speak German fluently, and that was much easier. Arabic, I can't say I speak it fluently, but it is hard, and there's many different dialects. And so when you're traveling from between different countries, they speak differently. So it feels like you need to learn almost a new language. If you're spending time in Lebanon versus Iraq, for example. So it's hard, but I speak Iraqi dialect, and I can get by in other countries with my Iraqi Arabic. But it's like a lifelong project for anyone if they're thinking about learning Arabic, I think.
And the other thing is, I'm sorry, I'm sure you've told the story, it's like you're walking around with a cast on your arm and the whole world wants to know, what did you do to your arm? Well, if you say, I was kidnapped in Iraq, I can't not ask you about that. So what in heaven's name was that experience like?
So thankfully it was short. I was kidnapped for about 10 days, like I said, in Sinjar, Iraq. And I was thankfully released without being harmed at all. But I was kidnapped at the time by members of the people that kidnapped me. They said at the time that they were like Sunni Ba'athist resistance fighters fighting against the American occupation. But that was not true. In fact, they were Kurdish, some people that had affiliations with the Kurdish autonomous government in northern Iraq. There's a close ally of the US and of Israel, but they, like everything in the Middle East, people do things and then you blame it on other people. Everything's, there's a lot of false flag type stuff going on. But, thankfully, I got out after just 10 days. And so I was a lot luckier than many, many other people. As I mentioned, my colleague, Tom Fox, who worked with me in Baghdad with Christian peacemaker teams, he was kidnapped and held for about 6 months, and he was finally murdered. He was shot and basically executed. So, of course, I was very lucky to get out as easily as I did.
Some people would have an experience like that and think, I think I want to just move to the U.S. now. But there you are, still doing what you're doing.
It's a bad experience, but thankfully it was a long time ago. But again, people in the Middle East are such wonderful people. There's all these political problems that creates chaos and bad things. But at the same time, I also have met the most wonderful people there, whether Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Christians. The Middle Eastern Christians in Iraq and Syria are some of the most amazing people. And also the Yazidi religious minority. Maybe I've met so many amazing Yazidis. Your listeners might remember back in 2014 when ISIS was at the height of its power in Iraq and Syria. They invaded the Sinjar region of Iraq. Again, that's where I was kidnapped. But ISIS invaded, also with backing from the Kurds, the Kurdish autonomous government, and backing from the US. They invaded the Sinjar region, and ISIS took thousands of Yazidi women as sex slaves. They massacred thousands of Yazidi men and ethnically cleansed much of that area. Everyone knows that ISIS carried out that genocide against Yazidis, but very few people know that Masoud Barzani, the Kurdish leader in Iraq, was behind it, that he helped plan it and basically used ISIS as a proxy. But again, I've just throughout all these years, I've just met so many amazing, wonderful people. I spent a lot of time with Yazidis, interviewing them to write articles about the genocide and what happened. And so, yeah, I just feel very grateful for the time I've had, both earlier in life and then these last couple of years to be in the Middle East again and to get to know so many great people.
Well, let's take a moment, Will, to acknowledge that we are in fundraising mode for the Libertarian Institute. I sit on the board, but I don't collect any payment or anything. I just sit on the board because I believe in the Libertarian Institute. But it does really important work. It also happened to publish my most recent book. It does. I mean, everything it does that you like the publishing of articles, the books, the events, everything. It all costs more than you think. But they run that thing on such a shoestring budget. They make every dollar count. And I can attest, as I've told people, I've been at Scott Horton's house. He does not live in a mansion. That is not where the money goes. He is extremely careful with how donor money is spent. He views that as a matter of the most significant trust, as a charge to him. And so I want to urge people to be part of that, because these things don't pay for themselves. And we should put our money where our mouth is. We say, oh, well, if something is worthwhile, it will be funded voluntarily. Okay, well, here's your opportunity to fund it voluntarily. Libertarianinstitute.org/donate is where to go and donate. And you can be contributing to the good work, for example, that our new friend Will here is doing, and the work of a great many other people whose work is very important and which provides a unique voice. We're not just another anti-war voice. We've got a unique voice. And even if we were just another anti-war voice, there aren't enough of those anyway.
Yeah.
And that would be reason enough. But the stable of writers and just good people that Scott Horton has built up around this Libertarian Institute is truly something to behold. So I really, really would urge you, especially after hearing Will today, to be part of that and to head to libertarianinstitute.org/donate and know that anything you send gets put to really important use. It is not paying for some think tank CEO's chauffeur. It is. I mean, Scott has an old truck. That's what he drives. So it ain't nothing like that. It is run exactly the way you as a donor would want it to be run. So, Will, I don't mean to monopolize that, but do you have a word you'd like to say too?
No, I would just second that. And I know no one's getting rich off of doing work for the Libertarian Institute. And I mean, that's very accurate. And again, Scott's done an excellent job with the Institute, and he's been one of the most principled anti-war voices in the United States for decades. I remember listening to his interviews going all the way back in, say, 2004. I mean, he's been doing it forever, and he's been, again, such a principled anti-war voice. And he was the first one that gave me the opportunity to write articles about the Syria war. And I got, I remember writing articles. Some of them were 60, 70 pages, and I would send it in, and he'd send me $100, articles that I would take 6 months writing. So he'd send me $100 just, as a courtesy, but he's not paying people a lot of money. They're working on, a shoestring, and it's really great work that they do. And so I can verify what you just said.
Well, again, libertarianinstitute.org/donate. Please go do that. Will, I'm really glad to have had a chance to talk to you. Looking forward to your book coming out. I'm going to link in the video description as well as on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/2618, to your X account and to the Cradle as well. But libertarianinstitute.org/donate is the action item for today. Will, thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Tom. Very nice to meet you for the first time, and I appreciate the invite. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.